Welcome to the section on vectors versus pixels. But actually, what I'm going to talk about is vector-based images versus pixel-based images. Now, I'm just going to give a broad overview of this topic. If you're looking for more detail, just head on over to the lecture notes, and there's a few links there that I think will be of interest for you guys to kind of, read up and find out a little bit more detail on those topics. Okay, so here in this image, I got a vector-based image and a pixel-based image. And at this size, it looks perfectly fine. There doesn't look like there's any difference in the images. The quality looks great. But where the story unfolds is when I scale in and I look at this image, and no matter how much I scale in, it stays nice and clean and crisp on the edges. All the good detail is there, right? If I move on over to the other image, which is pixel-based, you see something different. And you see these tiny little squares? These tiny little squares are called pixels. And pixels are the most fundamental element of a graphical image in a pixel-based image. So each one of these pixels has a bunch of attributes and details that describe this image. Whereas if you look over here at the vector-based image, it's nice and clean. Well, the difference with this particular image is the fact that this object is actually described all by math. So, of course, we're just dealing with numbers. Computers work with numbers, and you're going to have a nice, clean image when you're just dealing with math. So that's the big thing that you need to know about pixel-based images versus vector-based images. But I'm just going to give you one more example, actually, I'm going to give you a scenario where you may run into, and you need to understand why this is important. This image, let's just say this image here is part of a logo, right, that you did for a client. And the client just needed it for their business card and needed for some stationery. And, I did it at a size that's on an 8.5 by 11, and this is a great size. I could shrink this down for a business card. All that detail's there. It's beautiful, right? Where you start to run into a problem is if your client comes to you and says, hey, I need this logo to be blown up to be put on a billboard or on the side of a plane or, 10 by 10 booth display. And so if I had done this image in a pixel-based application, I may run into some issues where I try to scale it up and I lose detail and it's all just a mess, right? So we don't want to run into that nightmare. And so that's why it's important to know what you're going to do with the file, one, and two, also what type of workflow that you're using, because there are certain effects that you can apply to a graphic, on a pixel-based graphic, that you can't apply to a vector-based graphic, and there are certain effects that you can apply on vectors that you can't apply on pixels. And you will only understand that if you spent some time working in other illustration applications where you'll run into that. So what people do is they'll do some things in vector, and then they'll take it over to the pixel-based application, and they'll do some effects there and do some kind of touching or shading or something like that, and then they'll bring it back into their vector application. So it's just like a lot of back and forth, right? Well, Affinity Designer is a little bit different because they've actually nicely kind of put these two worlds together, and they now have a system where it's a vector application, but it does have some tools in the areas of pixels that you could actually kind of use both together, all in the same application. It's not a full-fledged image editing application, so don't get that confused. But there are some tools and some workflows that require you going back and forth that you no longer have to do with Affinity Designer. So that's the only thing that I wanted to kind of share with you guys, and hopefully that gives you a good overview. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comments, or send me a message or a tweet or something, and hopefully I can answer them for you as quickly as possible. All right, that's it. Let's move on to the next lecture. Thanks.